It's 2022, and two of Europe's largest countries are at war. The clash over the whole of the Ukrainian nation has led many to look back at the foreshadowing events of 2014, when Russia entered into the Crimean Peninsula and annexed the territory for itself. Ever since then, peace has been patchy throughout the eastern regions of Ukraine, as Russian-backed separatists have made stability unachievable. This is what most people know when it comes to the history of Crimea. It's generally believed that this all boils down to the peninsula simply having a large ethnic Russian population. But this would be a dangerous simplification. In fact, Crimea has more than just Russian-speaking citizens. It also has a history as part of Russia. That is, of course, until Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev handed it over to the Ukrainian SSR. So, why exactly did he do that? First, we must look at how Crimea even became a part of the USSR to begin with. The peninsula has actually passed through many hands during history, including Kievan Rus, the Mongols, the Crimean Tatars, the Ottoman Empire, and eventually, at the end of the 18th century, the Russian Empire. As such, Crimea has not always been a territory of either Ukraine or Russia, though both have a history intertwined in part with the peninsula. However, by the period of the USSR, Russia had possessed Crimea for a notable amount of time and generally considered the territory to be undeniably and unquestionably Russian. Nevertheless, the situation shifted even before Ukraine obtains the peninsula, as the USSR leadership decided to grant Crimea the status of an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1921. This would remain the case until 1945. During this period of Soviet autonomy, life in Crimea, such as the Tatars, was far from easy. Ethnic and religious persecution caused the suffering and death of countless Crimeans under Joseph Stalin. Autonomy for Crimea seemed to have little to no effect on such tragedies, and after the end of the Second World War, the Soviet leaders decided to reabsorb the peninsula into the Russian SFSR. This would last for just under a decade, however. On February 27, 1954, the Soviet state paper Pravda had this to say: Decree of the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet transferring Crimea province from the Russian Republic to the Ukraine Republic, taking into account the integral character of the economy, the territorial proximity, and the close economic ties between Crimea province and the Ukraine Republic, and approving the joint presentation of the Presidium of the Russian Republic Supreme Soviet and the Presidium of the Ukraine Republic Supreme Soviet on the transfer of Crimea province from the Russian Republic to the Ukraine Republic. In what seems to be an unexpected move to many, Nikita Khrushchev, contemporary leader of the Soviet Union, apparently gifted an entire peninsula to the Ukrainian SSR with the purpose, allegedly, to be a demonstration of the eternal brotherhood between Russians and Ukrainians. This is a poor explanation, though, as are the ones given in Pravda. For one, the claim about economic ties to Ukraine didn't make a lot of sense. For the most part, Crimea was a tourist destination for outside citizens of the rest of the USSR, and its economy reflected that. To say that the economy of Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula had some kind of unique connection was quite a stretch. Many believe that the true economic justification instead lies in the fact that Moscow was hoping to hand off the responsibility of rebuilding one of the hardest-hit regions in World War II. Although this too comes under question, as the transfer happened nearly a decade after the war had ended. Additionally, over 13% of Ukraine's state budget relied on subsidies from Moscow. which had increased fairly drastically since the end of the war, and would have still kept Moscow involved economically in the rebuilding of Crimea. However, the concept of a genuine territorial connection between the peninsula and Ukraine does surely exist. Crimea only shares land with the territory of Ukraine, not Russia. But Pravda stating this as a reason for the land transfer seems a bit nonsensical, given that this land connection had existed as long as the peninsula had. It wasn't new, and this never stopped Russia from claiming Crimea at any point before. So why would the territorial bond matter now? Furthermore, culturally, Crimea had strong ties to Russia. Due to the past centuries as a part of the Russian Empire, and the overwhelming ethnic Russian majority created by repeated efforts of ethnic cleansing and Russification. Some speculate that the RSFSR did this intentionally, using Crimea as a way to have their say in the internal affairs of Ukraine through its Russian citizens. Still, this theory doesn't stand too strong. Instead, others, including the descendants of Nikita Khrushchev, posit different reasons as to why the Soviet leader would do something so stunning. The great-granddaughter of Nikita, Nina Khrushcheva, believes that the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine had a lot to do with her great-grandfather's love for Ukraine. It was somewhat symbolic, somewhat trying to reshuffle the centralized system, and also, full disclosure, Nikita Khrushchev was very fond of Ukraine, she explained in an interview with NPR. I think to some degree it was also a personal gesture toward his favorite republic. He was ethnically Russian, but he felt great affinity with Ukraine. Nikita had also married a Ukrainian woman after working in Ukrainian mines in his youth before joining and eventually leading its Communist Party. So, it is possible that, to mark the anniversary of Ukraine's merger with the Russian Empire, Nikita Khrushchev truly wanted to extend an olive branch of brotherly love to his favorite republic. It's possible, but probable, many don't believe so. Nevertheless, this could have been the case, had it also been motivated by yet another factor: Holodomor. Holodomor was the terror famine of Soviet Ukraine that lasted a year between 1932 to 1933 and saw the death by starvation of anywhere from 3.5 to 5 million Ukrainians. Today, over a dozen countries recognize this catastrophe as a genocide, and others have labeled it a crime against humanity committed by the regime of Joseph Stalin. It was the policies of the dictator himself that artificially triggered the famine, and many allege that it was done intentionally to target Ukraine and prevent its ability to break free or cause any other problems for the Soviet Union. Subsequently, many speculate that Nikita Khrushchev wanted to hand over Crimea to the Ukrainian SSR as a kind of apology for the events in the 1930s. And while some Russians today give credence to this theory, it still cannot be confirmed as even part of the reasoning behind the transfer. Lastly, another theory, and one which has been mentioned by the great-granddaughter of the Soviet leader, is that Khrushchev simply wanted to reduce the centralization of the USSR and saw this as a way to do so. As the successor of Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev had a responsibility to try and rectify the mistakes of his predecessor, and it's possible that the transfer of Crimea from one Soviet republic to another was just another step in this process. However, just as with the other guesses, this cannot be confirmed nor denied. Many theories abound as to why the Russian SFSR was willing to hand over an entire once autonomous territory to the Ukrainian SSR, and Pravda did give what some would call an explanation, yet we still don't know exactly what the reason was. It's very likely that Nikita Khrushchev's love of Ukraine played some kind of role in the decision, but still, This was not something he could have chosen to do entirely on his own. So, there was obviously some kind of motivation for the administration as a whole to support the transfer. Scholars just can't agree on what the reason or reasons were. The most likely explanation is that more than one of the stated theories, or others as well, culminated in the ultimate decision being made. It's important to keep in mind that at the time of the transfer, the RSFSR had no clue that only a few decades later, the Soviet Union would collapse and Ukraine would no longer have any administrative or brotherly ties to Russia. At that time, all of these territories were part of just one single country, the Soviet Union. Had this been predictable, it could have played a drastic role in potentially preventing the absorption of Crimea into Ukraine, but alas, no one saw it coming. Thus, it is reasonable to assume that there may have been an economic motive, given that while Moscow would still be supporting the Ukrainian economy in some way, the burden caused by Crimea would be notably reduced. There also could have been a motivation to ensure a region of strong ethnic Russian majority in Ukraine, as we see utilized even today as a talking point for Moscow. Furthermore, Nikita Khrushchev might have been truly in love with Ukraine, and possibly had his own biased opinions about it, thus granting the Republic what he saw as a gift and a sign of trust. Still, others within the administration might have felt some guilt about the events of Holodomor, or saw the territory transfer as a way to reduce centralization and save face after the Stalin regime and its horrors. And most undeniably, Ukraine, not Russia, had a land connection to Crimea, and as such, it always would have made more sense for Ukraine to possess the peninsula. Amongst the other reasons, this may have finally proved relevant to the USSR leadership. But at the end of the day, this remains all speculation nevertheless.